Pastor Mark, I'll kick off with you. Tell us, what does church growth look like? Many people would think it's more campuses and more services. Is that correct?
It can be. I think that's the fruit. That's the result. That's what you get at the end. Certainly, I think it's something that you aim for, but I think there's an undergirding of other things that should be there. You know, I think when I talk to guys or girls about growth, I probably start with the concept of health. Healthy things grow, so if we can get it healthy and alive and that sort of thing, then it will eventually grow. So, and I think, therefore, it's probably more of an issue of defining health first, and then things will eventually grow. So, I mean, it's great to have great big services and so on, but I think if that's the aim, then often many leaders, including us, you know, we can get disappointed pretty quickly. So
what does health look like?
I knew you were going to ask that question. Look, I think it probably means different things to different people. I think the basics of health, from my point of view, are that it's got a clear vision. Yeah. And that not just the visionary knows the vision, but it's the church community gets it and they own that. Mm-hmm. I think it's outward looking, so that it's not just self-focused, but it's connected to the community. Yeah. And knows and begins to meet the needs of the community. I think that it develops good, healthy teams so that people are engaged. There's a high level of cultural engagement and team engagement. And probably the last thing that I can think of right now is that it's got a culture of multiplication. So things that are within it multiply. So connect groups are multiplying, disciples are multiplying, and eventually things like services and congregations begin to multiply. And that's when you start to see that external numbers growth. Yeah. But it really starts at the core, almost like a cell dividing. So if you see disciples multiplying, like discipling each other, and connect groups multiplying, you probably down the line will begin to see a whole bunch of other things happen as well. Yeah. So when I go to a church to visit or talk to the pastor, that's often what I'm looking for first. And then eventually those other things begin to take place.
Yeah. So. You have, within your church and your team, you've been able to reach a range of people from different cultures, different countries. How was that a strategy? Has that just happened naturally? Is that something you felt like God, asked you to do? Like, how did that come about?
Yeah. Silverwater is a very multi-ethnic church. You'd have to say it's like a snapshot of heaven, which totally. I love. Yeah. And it does reflect the diversity in the geography around Silverwater. What's awesome is Jesus is just so winning for every ethnic group, and under the banner of Jesus, everyone comes in with their uniqueness and their traditions, and they unite. And so it's amazing at Silverwater. I don't feel any cultural divide amongst the groups. They just unite under Jesus. Wow. And what we've found is, I remember we started with one African, Patrick, great guy. And what happened in establishing him in leadership, it put in front of the people, it made it clear that we value diversity in putting him up in a leadership role. And now there's this whole right wing of Silverwater in the seating section on a Sunday morning, which is overflowing with Africans. So I would say that's a strategy in making sure that there's diversity across our worship team, our platform team. It shows that we value and are releasing and endorsing these groups, and awesome. The increase comes that way. Even things like making sure we have translation available to bridge the language divide. We've seen a big influx of Syrians in a recent season, and we've made sure that we've got Arabic translation available. And what we're doing is not just translating language, we're actually translating culture. So in the translation throughout the service, because the Syrians are coming from a more subdued, traditional worship expression, and a C3 is so dynamic and loud and, passionate. And so our translator is actually translating the culture as well. This is what's happening as the meeting leader exhorts thoughts, and this is why we're lifting our hands. And
so they're describing it. And
totally unpackaging it for the people, which is really helpful because then it just disarms any apprehension they might have. And it's awesome in our salvation altar calls in the recent season. Sometimes half the altar is filled with Syrians, half is filled with Persians, and there's translation happening on both sides. And I feel like this is such a sacred moment. My total heartburst. It's amazing.
Now, Cathy, you oversee a whole region, or have a lot of input into a whole separate region, plus, of course, See Through Ride. Yes. What are some of the keys and strategies, do you think, that have been successful in your journey of church growth?
Well, we've planted a lot of churches overseas in quite difficult nations, which, to begin with, wasn't even in our mind. It just, the Lord really placed something on Richard, and so Richard just went to sea. And then one thing after another happened, and Richard has always believed that we need to plant churches where we already have a relationship. So we've planted many churches in many different nations, but prior to that has been many, many years of relationship. And some of the keys are understanding that we have a wonderful core values in C3, and so to transport that into other nations is actually just such a wonderful opportunity. I totally believe that C3 just has this breath and life about it, and so all of the nations of the world really need it. They need Jesus, and so we've just kind of gone wherever the Lord has taken us to, but it's understanding the context of where we are and not offending, but also giving people the opportunity to rise in a more culturally relevant and brighter expression perhaps of the kingdom. One of the greatest problems that not we face, but the church planters face, is the biggest obstacle of all is persecution for them, and so that's been something we've really had to navigate. So they kind of experience persecution on several levels. One is perhaps from a majority religion around them, there's an obvious persecution. Another is from traditional churches that feel very threatened by something new, and so that's caused a lot of opposition, and also bureaucratic difficulties. So in every nation there's many, many rules around what Christians can and can't do, and so that's been quite difficult. And the other thing that's actually we've noticed is that often when somebody becomes a believer in those nations, they lose their entire family. So you've got persecution on many levels, but I will say that they are amazing. Like, they are unbelievable. Their resilience, the resilience of the church planters, because we need to remember it's not just them, it's their little children and it's their families. Many of them have the opportunity to leave but decide to stay. And so they've got this incredible resilience. I just look at them and I think, oh my goodness. And the other thing I would say, they adapt easily. So one beautiful church which we planted about 3 years ago has had enormous growth, and it's in a very difficult region with a lot of opposition. And so every time somebody becomes a Christian, they are forced to leave their family. So the little church itself has nearly all of their young adults living at the church with the pastor and their family, which is not something we would face. No. So I don't have all of the young adults living at my house from our church, and so they adapt so well. They really, I look at them and I think, oh my goodness, you are mighty. And so they grow so rapidly, and it's just such a delight. And when there's a salvation, like in those places, we all rejoice. Even back at Ride, when we know, we really rejoice, and it's just, our church is totally on board with all of that. Like, we just really feel that's our call as a church. That's our call. That's what we really love to do, and so our hearts are knitted with theirs. So,
How do you support them and encourage the pastors and like, I mean, from over here? Like, what?
Well, there's a couple of things that work really well. One is that Richard travels there often in order to mentor them and help them along. They love any connection at all. The other thing is we sometimes send teams over there, which makes a huge difference when an ordinary member in the church comes back and says, I know this pastor and that pastor, and their hearts are just so knitted. And the other thing is that when we're able to, we bring those pastors to Ride, and it gives them the opportunity to watch, because sometimes it's hard to explain what the possibilities are for them. But when they can actually see it on an ordinary Sunday, they often go, oh, got it. And so that's perhaps our best way. But Richard does much travelling backwards and forwards to mentor and support and encourage, and it's good.
Do you find any of that kind of dynamic at work at Silverwater, or people are...
actually there's a number of themes that I'm picking up on that Cathy's articulating, and there's a lot of likeness. So local Australian church, but with the multi-ethnic groups of people, and in the far corners of the earth. Things like the opposition, the religious opposition amongst the Syrians. There's been a pull. There's direct opposition to Pentecostal churches so they find themselves in decision-making points. The importance to be culturally sensitive is another thing. Definitely not to be dismissive of values which go from generation to generation to generation, but to enlarge our hearts, to embrace those details. And the gift of hospitality to build the local church. I feel that Silverwater is uniquely blessed in the richness, because the value of hospitality and the value of family that those ethnic groups bring to the church, there's such a special sense of love in that place because of that. So there's a lot of likeness, both globally and locally.
I'm sure we've all heard the phrase, everything rises and falls on leadership.
Yep.
How do you think that relates to church growth? Like, how much do you think it is, on the leader and where they are in their personal walk and, things they've got going on in their own life?
Sure, yeah. I definitely think that the growth of the leader affects the growth of the church. So we've all heard... I'm assuming that you can have a lid on your leadership. I think the personal growth of the leader can be a lid on the growth of the church. And so yes, I think it's absolutely connected.
And for people that are watching who are leaders, how can they be aware or kind of do a self-awareness check, I guess? I'm sure Mark will have the proper term for it. What could be their possible blind spots, their strengths, opportunities for growth?
How do you keep growing as a leader?
Yes.
Is that what you're asking me? Well, I think the obvious ones are your devotional life has to be of utmost importance. The word, praying, listening to the Holy Spirit, being a continual learner is very important. Not thinking that you know it all, being teachable, being humble, listening to others, having people speak into your life, all of those things.
I think one thing to remember when you're leading is that people can't follow where you can't lead. And so you have to always be in that position of thinking, I can do this in Jesus, because unless I go there, they can't come with me. And so that, I think it's an incredible opportunity. It's such an opportunity to move into greater things, knowing that people willingly follow, but they can't get there if you can't go there.
And I think the authenticity of a leader is important too. I think that people often think that you live this perfect life, and people can't follow that though, because they've got their own struggles, and they're thinking, well, that's of no value to me because you've got the perfect life. So I think a level or a good level of authenticity, and even describing your own trial of faith, because it's only the trial of faith that grows people anyway. Because God grows everybody the exact same way. There's no exceptions, whether you're a leader or not leader, what have you. Everyone goes through a trial of faith, and then that expands your walk with God and your capacity and everything else. And so I think sharing your own journey of that process, I think, is super important. But like Mel said and Cathy, staying on that journey. Because it's not like you arrive. I mean, one day I'd like to arrive and be really good. And one day we will, I think. We are going to arrive. But in the meantime, we're all on that journey. And when I've seen people stop growing is when they've got off, purely as one thing, they've got off the path. And I just keep saying to people, stay on the path. Because there's no other path except a very destructive one. So,
Are there things that you've been able to do to help pastors that have...
I hope so,
have wavered from the path, as you use the term?
Yeah, I mean, when I see signs of the wandering, social media is sometimes valuable because sometimes I can hear a sound in the words. We'd say tone, and I'm like, oh, it doesn't feel right. So maybe a bit of contact, or because connection helps. I think. The Bible talks about warn those who that's a very big word, warn, but I think you can warn with grace and love and mercy, and because it's often a heart that's been disaffected somewhere along the line, whether towards God or the church, that begins to wander. So I think if you can repair that, maybe gets them back on the track a bit.
I think from a younger person looking at people like Pastor Mark and all you guys here, it's incredible the value of example. And I think if we relate it back to church growth, I think a growing church is full of growing people. And I think the beauty of a young person having those examples where you can actually if you do feel yourself kind of swaying in the breeze sometimes, and you can kind of recenter on, people who have already done the distance. And I think an encouragement to the older generation would be actually your example is more valuable than you know. And actually it does keep us young guys centered and, people to look to, how Paul said, follow me as I follow the example of Christ. I think that's really, really important.
It's funny you talk about the example, because I was just thinking about how our children, and parenting and pastoring is so similar, is that they actually copy what we do, not what we say. And as leaders, I know, but we have authority in the things that we do, not what we say. And when we're leading leaders as well, it's what we do that we have authority in. And sometimes I watch a worship leader and they're trying to bring a breakthrough, and they'll say something like, come on, let's lift our voice. They say it, but they don't do it. And then there's a ceiling on the meeting, people don't follow them. But if they only lifted and exhorted themselves, then the breakthrough would come and the people would follow them there. So the power of doing, not just saying, is amazing.
Wow. Awesome. Yeah, that's a good point. A lot of people think that, church growth it's all about the senior minister and it's their responsibility. And, what can volunteers and team members do to help with church growth?
I think one of the key words is responsibility and ownership. And I feel like if I look at my generation, there's a lot of spectators and not many participators. And I think that is an issue, because I think ownership, I think it does two things. One, it silences the inner voice of criticism. I think often when we're spectating, it's easy to criticise, it's easy to be cynical. I think as soon as we take ownership, if we were to be critical, we'd be critical of ourselves because we've owned it. But also what it does is I think ownership breeds creativity, because because it's yours, you care for it, and therefore you want to, not only do you see the problems, and I think there's nothing wrong with seeing issues, but when you're taking ownership, you see solutions as well. I think ownership really breeds problem solvers, and I think that's probably what we need the most of, is we have a lot of problem givers, not many problem solvers, And I think probably the other side of the coin is that we need to probably change our perception that I'm not attending church, I am the church. I think when we do that, we really, our whole mentality changes. And so if the church is struggling, I'm struggling. If the church is thriving, I'm thriving. And I think that's such an important thing. And I think probably part of that as well is that we are actually champions of the vision. And so wherever we go, it's not just, it takes it out of Sunday. So on a Monday morning, I'm the church. On a Tuesday when I go to school, I'm the church. When I go to work on a Wednesday, I am the church. And I'm representing God, I'm representing my church, I'm representing my pastors. And I think the beautiful image of it in Scripture is when Moses is on the hill and Joshua's in the valley, and then you got Aaron and Hur either side. And I think that's a beautiful picture of the team working. And it's not just the leader, it's not just the volunteers, it's not just the team members and the staff, but they're all actually playing a part together. And I think that's awesome.
Can I ask Mitch, because one of my points of concern sometimes is how to mobilise the next generation out of the place of consideration and spectating into mobility and buying and sacrifice in particular. Have you had any breakthroughs or thoughts as a leader in that generation?
I think it's case by case. I think young people today, or millennials even, are very, they need a lot of permission. I found that they're very reluctant to take initiative. And so and I think there's a few factors in there. I think there's a generational factor, there's a family breakdown factor across the generation that has caused a lot of young people to be timid. And I think as leaders, the importance of us showing encouragement and unconditional love and just giving people permission not only to succeed but to fail. I think a lot of people are stuck in this weird place of stagnancy out of fear. You know, and you see even Paul encouraging Timothy in that sort of generational model where he says, hey, you've not been given a spirit of fear or timidity, but power. And I think that encouragement to the younger generation is really important.
Can I ask one more question, Em?
Yeah.
I'm wearing your hat.
No, it's not. This is a round table. You guys talk and I'll sit back.
Just about the absence of mothers and fathers and the changing of the family shape and raising a generation that really need the spirit of adoption and a lot of love. Can you talk a bit about your insight into that coming around the next generation?
Sure. I think young people have lost a lot of identity. I think that what you're alluding to there is young people are very confused. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of prevailing voices. And because of the lack of the family unit and the lack of the voice of the father and the voice of the mother, it's actually caused a lot of murky waters around our generation's identity. And I think we've probably all experienced, I know I have, when there's a kind of a double-mindedness in who we are, there's a apathy about what we do. And I think our ability, and that's why the church's voice is so important, because and the generation that have gone before us is their voice, because it's actually stabilising what truth is, and it's bringing a sense of clarity into those murky waters and really empowers young people.